Hello and welcome to Dreams of Past. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine standing on a frozen shoreline where the sea breathes fog and the wind tastes like salt and iron. The world around you is silent, except for the crack of ice and the faint creak of wooden beams from a lonely hut. This is where our story begins, in a land where survival itself was an art and courage was as common as the cold. Tonight we drift back to the 8th century to meet the people who would one day be called Vikings. Before there were ships, before there were raids or kings or legends, there was only the north. Norway, Sweden, Denmark. Lands carved by glaciers and shadowed by long winters. The sun here was a guest, visiting only a few hours each day. The rest belonged to the dark. But the dark wasn't empty. It was alive, with the hiss of waves beneath the ice, the flicker of firelight in wooden halls, and the quiet murmur of stories told to survive the endless nights. Families lived close together, bound by the cold. They shared mead, stories, and silence. And maybe that silence, that long, unbroken quiet, shaped them more than anything. It made them patient. It made them dreamers. It made them restless. Picture a small wooden house pressed against the wind. Inside, smoke curls up to a hole in the roof. A woman weaves beside the fire. A child carves a small figure from driftwood. Outside, a man checks his fishing lines frozen into the fjord. That's the rhythm of life here, simple, hard, and strangely peaceful. Every meal was earned from land that barely wanted to feed you. Every journey was a risk, but every sunrise, even a cold one, felt like a victory. They farmed where they could, on thin soil between the rocks. They fished, hunted, and traded furs. And when the seas froze or storms closed in, they told stories. Because stories were warmth. The word Viking didn't even exist yet. These people didn't wake up one morning and decide to raid England. They were farmers, carpenters, dreamers and wanderers. But they lived surrounded by water, and water has a strange power. It reflects the sky, it whispers of faraway lands. And when you spend your whole life staring out across that horizon, one thought eventually grows louder than fear. What's out there? That question, whispered by fishermen, sung by poets, passed down by firesides, was the seed of everything that followed. Raids, trade, exploration. All of it started here in this quiet longing to know what lay beyond the mist. Of course, not every Viking dreamer was a brave explorer. Some just wanted a bigger farm. Some just wanted to avoid taxes, which, by the way, existed even back then. And some probably looked at those early shipbuilders and said, "You want to sail where? Over that?" Yet curiosity is contagious. Once one person came back with stories of warmer lands, of gold, of people who'd never seen snow, others followed. That's how legends start. Not with kings or warriors, but with one tired farmer staring out to sea and saying, "What if?" Archaeologists later found clues of this early world. Tiny farms, longhouses, tools and graves filled with care. You can almost see them. Someone placing a comb beside a body, or a small iron knife, or even a cup. Little signs that these weren't faceless barbarians. They were people, with jokes and fears and dreams, same as us. They sang to the sea. They named the stars. And when storms took their ships, they buried their dead facing west, toward the unknown. The sagas would later say that courage was the greatest virtue. But in truth, endurance came first. Before courage, before glory, they had to survive the night. And as the fire burns low in that small wooden hall, outside, the snow begins to fall again, soft, endless and forgiving. Somewhere out on the horizon, a whisper of wind ripples the water. And a thought takes shape, a thought that will carry them farther than anyone believed possible. Because in the silence of the north, something is stirring. The sea is calling. In the next chapter, we'll follow that sound, from the frozen fjords to the halls of the gods, and see how faith, fear, and imagination built the heart of a civilization. The sea has quieted now. You're still drifting, a low mist on the water, a faint shimmer of moonlight on the horizon. But somewhere inland, a fire burns bright against the snow. That's where we're going next. To meet the gods of the north. Before there were kingdoms or written words, the Vikings looked up. Every light in the night sky had meaning. A story, a warning, a memory. When thunder rolled through the mountains, they said Thor was riding. When the northern lights shimmered green and silver across the heavens, they said it was the reflection of the Valkyrie's armour. shining as they carried fallen warriors to Odin's hall. To the Norse, the world wasn't a random place. It was alive. Every tree, every gust of wind, every mountain peak had a spirit. And the gods weren't distant. They were neighbours, walking unseen in the snow. In their minds, all of existence was tied together by one great ash tree, Yggdrasil. Its roots reached deep into the underworld, its branches touched the heavens, and somewhere in between, right there in the middle, was Midgard, the world of men. Beneath the tree, a dragon gnawed at the roots. Above it, an eagle perched in silence, and somewhere between them, a squirrel ran up and down, spreading gossip between heaven and hell. Everything connected, everything balanced, and through this living map, the Norse people found their place. Small but not insignificant. They weren't the centre of the universe, but they were part of its story. Two gods ruled their imaginations more than any others. First came Odin, the All-Father, a wanderer in a cloak, one eye missing, searching the world for wisdom. He wasn't just a ruler, he was a seeker, trading comfort for knowledge. He hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days, wounded and alone, to learn the secret of the runes, the written words of power. Then there was Thor, louder, warmer, easier to love. Where Odin whispered riddles, Thor just hit things. He was the hammer in the storm, the friend of farmers, the protector of humankind. Between them, you had both sides of Viking life, the thinker and the fighter, the poet and the worker. Two halves of the same soul. But every story needs a bit of chaos, doesn't it? That's where Loki comes in. Smart, funny, unpredictable, and always, one joke away from disaster. The sagas say Loki could shapeshift into anything. A fly, a fish, even a mare that once gave birth to Odin's 8-legged horse. But Loki wasn't pure evil. He was necessary. He stirred the pot, kept the gods humble, made sure the story kept moving. Even chaos had a purpose in their world. To the Vikings, destiny wasn't something you avoided. It was something you walked toward. They believed in the Norns, 3 weavers who spun the threads of every life, past, present, and future. From the roots of Yggdrasil itself. Even the gods couldn't escape what the Norns wove. Odin knew his end would come in a great final battle. Ragnarok, Simnar. And yet he prepared for it calmly. To the Norse mind, courage wasn't living forever. It was facing the end with eyes open. That quiet acceptance, that peace in the face of fate, became part of who they were. And maybe, just maybe, it's what made them such fearless explorers. Now forget grand temples. Most Norse worship happened outdoors, in forests, by waterfalls, or under the open sky. A stone altar, a wooden idol, a few offerings of food or carved runes. The air would smell like pine and smoke. Someone would pour ale into the earth, whisper a prayer, and thank the gods for fish or safe journeys. No choirs, no sermons, just gratitude, wind and firelight. Myths weren't bedtime stories. They were lessons, tools for survival. They taught courage, patience, humour in hardship. When lightning struck, it wasn't just weather. It was Thor reminding them he still watched. When a raven landed on a roof, they said Odin was listening. The world around them was a conversation. Every sound a word from the gods. And maybe that's why they saw no difference between faith and adventure. Both were ways of reaching for something bigger than yourself. So now as the embers fade and the wind hums outside the hall, you begin to understand the Viking heart. It was shaped by cold, carved by gods, and warmed by story. They didn't just believe in power, they believed in balance. In a world that could freeze you or feed you, bless you or drown you, depending on how you faced it. Next time, we'll see how that faith took form in wood and sail, when men turned belief into movement and built the ships that carried them across the world. The gods have spoken, the seas are restless, and somewhere along a frozen fjord, a sound rises that will change everything. It's the steady tap of hammer on wood, a heartbeat made of oak. Tonight we drift closer to the firelight, to watch as hands, rough from winter, shape the tool that will carry the Vikings into legend. This is the story of the Longship, the heart of a people who turned the sea itself into a road. It always began the same way, with a tree. The Vikings didn't have sawmills or steel cranes. They had axes, patience, and respect for the wood. A good ship started long before the first plank was cut. It started with knowing which tree would float and which would sink. Shipwrights walked deep into the forest, feeling bark with their palms, listening to how the wind moved through branches. They said a ship should be built from a tree that had heard the sea. In other words, something that had already learned to bend, not break. Once chosen, the oak was felled, shaped and soaked in tar made from pine sap and smoke. The smell, sharp, sweet, almost like burned honey, filled the air for days. Each plank curved like a rib. Each nail, hammered by hand, sang a note of rhythm. The shipbuilders didn't work from blueprints. They built by memory, by feel. And every hammer strike carried something deeper than craft. It carried hope. Because the longship wasn't just a tool, it was freedom. In a world where mountains blocked the horizon and winters locked the land, the sea was the only open door. With a ship, you could go anywhere. Trade, raid, explore, or simply see what lay beyond the mist. No horse could match it. No road could contain it. And when the first of those slender, shining vessels slid into the fjord, the people of the north saw something almost holy. The Viking longship was fast. Unbelievably fast. Light enough to carry across land, shallow enough to sail up rivers, strong enough to cross the open sea. A single vessel could glide over a wave like it was made of silk. It didn't crash through the ocean. It danced on it. The prow rose high, carved into the shape of beasts, dragons, wolves, serpents. Not just for decoration. These were guardians, meant to scare away spirits and enemies alike. And, if we're honest, to look really, really cool while doing it. The sides gleamed with tar and salt. Oars rested like wings along the hull, ready to strike rhythm when the wind fell silent. And above it all, a single square sail of red and white linen caught the breath of the gods. It wasn't just engineering, it was art. When a new ship was launched, the whole village came to watch. Children ran barefoot in the sand, women carried baskets of offerings, and old men stood quietly, remembering their own voyages. Each longship was given a name, something fierce, something proud. Sea Stallion, Wave Cutter, Serpent of the North. A name wasn't just a label, it was a promise. Every time the crew called it out, they reminded the sea who they were and what they dared to do. 50 men could row in perfect silence. 50 hearts, one pulse. When the wind blew just right, they'd lift their oars, let the sail fill, and the world would suddenly grow smaller beneath them. Now not every voyage went smoothly. Oars snapped. Food spoiled. Someone always forgot the mead. And then there was the smell, a mix of salt, sweat, and whatever the crew was trying to call fish stew. But even then they laughed. Because being on the ship wasn't about comfort. It was about belonging. Every splash of the oar reminded them, we built this with our own hands. And when storms came, and they always came, no one panicked. They just rowed harder, cursed louder, and waited for Thor to calm down. After all, if your god carries a hammer, maybe a little thunder is just his way of saying hello. The longship became the Viking flag, their calling card, their myth made real. It was seen on every shore from Greenland to Constantinople. Even enemies watching the horizon would whisper, they're coming. Yet what made it truly remarkable wasn't fear. It was precision. These ships connected worlds. They carried amber, silk, spices, and stories. They carried families seeking new homes, not just warriors chasing gold. Wherever a longship sailed, culture followed. Language, art, faith, trade. And centuries later, when historians tried to explain how a few icy villages changed the map of the world, they all pointed to the same thing, the longship. So as we drift beneath the stars tonight, imagine the soft creak of wood, the whisper of the sail, the quiet hum of oars in time. That sound, steady, calm, eternal, was the heartbeat of the Viking Age. It carried them across oceans into history, and eventually into legend. But the sea is only the beginning. In our next chapter, the horizon opens wider, where curiosity turns to courage, and the first voyages begin. The longships are ready now. Their hulls gleam with fresh tar. Their sails hang like quiet thunderclouds. The men stand waiting, oars in hand, hearts somewhere between fear and wonder. Tonight we follow them, not as raiders yet, but as explorers, sailing out for the very first time into the unknown. For generations, the sea had been a wall, cold, endless, unforgiving. But now, thanks to the longship, that wall became a doorway. Small groups left their fjords and followed the coastlines of Norway and Sweden, testing the wind, learning the moods of the sea. Each trip went a little farther. Each return brought new stories. One crew found an island covered in puffins. They called it the bird place. Another discovered that if you keep sailing east, the sun rises from the same direction you left it. That one confused people for years. They weren't trying to conquer yet. They were mapping the edges of their imagination. The first real voyages were short, trading amber, furs, and walrus ivory around the Baltic Sea. The water there was calmer, the distances shorter, the perfect classroom for a civilization learning to sail. At night, they'd anchor near the shore, light small fires, roast fish, and swap lies about sea monsters and sirens. No one truly believed them, of course, but everyone wanted to. Because what was the point of sailing if not for a good story? The Baltic taught them patience, how to read the wind, how to fix a sail mid-storm, how to navigate by stars instead of landmarks. And slowly, the Northmen realised something dangerous. They were good at this. Curiosity is a funny thing. It starts small, a question whispered by a fisherman, and ends up changing the world. One rumour told of soft green lands to the west, another of rich towns along the English coast, full of gold and grain. No one quite believed the stories, but they built more ships anyway. Just in case, someone said. One summer morning, with fog on the water and the sun bleeding red behind the mountains, the first crews pointed their dragon-proud ships west and rowed. They didn't know what they'd find, they didn't know if they'd return, but they went because staying home suddenly felt smaller than the sea. The North Sea was no friend. Its waves could rise higher than a hall roof. Its storms came fast, turning light into chaos in seconds. The longships flexed and moaned, oars snapped, water poured over the sides. Some crews sang to keep courage. Others cursed Thor. A few just kept rowing because, well, what else can you do? Humour was armour. If a wave soaked your clothes, you just joked that the sea liked you. If someone got seasick, you told them to feed the fish. And when they finally spotted land, green cliffs, white foam, the whole crew cheered like children. Not because they'd found riches, but because they'd survived. Those first landings were quiet. Small coves, empty beaches, strange birds calling from the rocks. Sometimes they met traders or monks who stared in awe at the dragon ships. Sometimes they met no one at all. They traded beads for fish, knives for grain, stories for silence. And yes, sometimes they took what they wanted. But early on, the line between trade and raid was thin. A deal gone bad, a misunderstanding, a shout lost in translation. Yet with each voyage they learned more. Which winds to follow, which harbours were friendly, which coasts hid reefs like teeth. They drew no maps, but the routes settled into their minds like memory. Life aboard became routine. Morning, row. Midday, row harder. Evening, eat dried fish. Tell jokes. Fix the sail. Someone always had a small drum, keeping time with the oars. The rhythm wasn't military. It was musical, like a heartbeat. The sea rocked them to sleep. The stars watched, and the longship glided on. That rhythm, oars, waves, breath, became the pulse of the Viking world. When one ship returned safely, others followed the same trail, then pushed a little farther. Soon there were paths across the water, invisible roads of memory and courage. What began as curiosity grew into something bigger. The sailors brought home more than treasure. They brought ideas, new foods, new words, new ways of building and trading. They saw bigger towns, different gods, and strange customs. And some of those ideas quietly changed the North. Children listened to stories of warm lands and wide rivers and thought, maybe one day I'll see them too. That was the start of expansion. Not greed, but imagination. Every voyage planted a seed, and soon those seeds would grow into colonies, kingdoms, and legends. The ships have proven themselves. The men have found courage in the mist. And the sea, once a wall, has opened like a book waiting to be read. But the next chapter in our story isn't just about discovery. It's about the moment the world noticed. When a quiet monastery on a lonely island heard the sound of oars and bells in the distance. Next time, the monastery at Lindisfarne. It begins quietly. A cold morning on a lonely island. The gulls are awake, the tide is coming in, and a handful of monks are lighting candles for prayer. They don't know it yet, but the sound they were about to hear will echo for 1,000 years. Off the northeastern coast of England lies Lindisfarne, a tiny strip of land connected to the mainland only at low tide. It was a place made for peace, simple stone huts, fields of barley bent by sea wind, a monastery famous for its devotion and its silence. To the monks, the world beyond the waves might as well have been another planet. They prayed, they copied manuscripts, they sang, and when storms rolled in, they simply closed their eyes and trusted God would take care of the rest. They had no idea that somewhere across that same grey sea, another people were also trusting their gods, sharpening axes, patching sails, and reading the sky. Far away, a fleet of longships waited in the fog. Their hulls were slick with salt. Their dragon-head prows glimmered faintly in moonlight. No grand speech, no drums, just quiet determination and the creak of wood. The men aboard weren't thinking about history or destiny. They were thinking about breakfast and maybe a bit of silver. They'd heard rumours, monks who kept gold and wine in their stone halls. They'd been told these islands had no soldiers, only bells. For men who had spent their lives fighting the sea, it sounded almost too easy. But the sea had taught them not to trust easy things, so they waited for dawn. The monks heard it first, in a deep, steady rhythm. Not thunder, not waves, something human. Oars. At first they thought it might be local fishermen seeking shelter. Then they saw the shapes. Long, thin boats cutting through the fog, each crowned with a carved dragon. One monk wrote later, "The sea seemed full of serpents. Panic spread, but there was nowhere to run. The tide had already risen. The island was trapped, just as the longships reached the shore. We know what happened next, though not in every detail. The Vikings came ashore fast and efficient, trained by a lifetime of storms. They took what was easy to carry: chalices, books bound in gold, food, and yes, a few captives. To the monks it must have felt like the end of the world. To the Vikings it was just another day's work. Risky, but rewarding. Yet even they didn't realise what they'd just started. Because news travelled, and fear travelled faster. Across England and Europe, one word began to spread: Northmen. The horror of the attack wasn't just in the violence, it was where it happened. A monastery was supposed to be sacred, protected by God himself. No one attacked monks. No one would dare. Until now. The church leaders were stunned. How could pagans reach so far, and why would they strike a place of peace? To them it was unimaginable. To the Vikings it was just practical. They weren't trying to destroy a religion. They were after wealth, food, and survival. They raided what others had because their own homeland offered little. It wasn't hatred, it was hunger. Within weeks, stories of the attack reached royal courts across Europe. Kings held meetings, bishops wrote letters, and frightened peasants began watching the sea with new eyes. The monks of Lindisfarne rebuilt, but something had changed forever. The illusion of safety was gone. The North had arrived. What no one understood then was that this was only the beginning. The Vikings didn't just vanish after one raid. They returned again and again. Not just to take, but to trade, to settle, to stay. The waves that once separated worlds had become bridges. It's easy from our warm beds centuries later to imagine the Vikings as villains, wild-eyed, roaring, swinging axes like thunder. But think of it from their side for a moment. You've just spent a year chopping wood, fishing in ice water, and arguing with your cousin over who stole your goat. Then someone tells you there's a place across the sea where gold sits in open rooms, guarded only by men who ring bells. You'd probably at least check it out. And in a strange way, that's what made them so human. They were curious, clever, hungry. Not monsters, just explorers with sharp tools. When the longships left Lindisfarne, they vanished into the fog the same way they'd come, silently. But their wake lingered, not just in the sea, but in history. The world now knew their name, and that name carried both fear and fascination. Next time, we'll follow what happened after the shock faded, when the raiders became traders, and the North began to build its empire not just with swords, but with silver and stories. The sound of swords fades. In its place comes the clink of silver, the creak of ships docking, and the low murmur of trade. After Lindisfarne, the world feared the Vikings. But fear isn't the full story. Because behind the raids came something else: markets, coins, and connections that tied the corners of Europe together. Tonight we sail not with raiders, but with traders. When people think of Vikings, they picture burning villages and flying axes. But most of them weren't warriors at all. They were merchants, practical, clever, and very good at turning danger into opportunity. They learned quickly that trade could be far more profitable than raiding, and less likely to get you stabbed before breakfast. Soon the same ships that once carried warriors began carrying amber, wool, honey and furs. The same men who once held swords now carried scales in for weighing silver. The North had discovered a new kind of conquest: commerce. At the edge of every major river and coastline, Viking trade towns began to rise. You could smell them before you saw them: tar, fish, smoke, and the sweet spice of foreign goods. There was Birka, in what is now Sweden, a bustling port filled with narrow wooden streets and stalls, overflowing with glass beads, fur pelts and linen. There was Hedeby, near the base of Denmark, where ships from the Baltic met traders from the North Sea. And Dublin, across the Irish Sea, once a Viking settlement, later a thriving city. Each port was a heartbeat in a new network, pulsing with life and silver. A visitor could hear 10 languages in a single morning: Norse, Arabic, Greek, Frankish, Celtic, all mixing together over mugs of ale and barrels of dried fish. The Vikings loved silver. Not gold, not jewels. Silver. They used it like a universal language. Coins from the Middle East marked with Arabic script have been found in Viking graves across Scandinavia. Imagine that. A coin minted in Baghdad, traded through Russia, handed off to a Norse sailor, and buried in the frozen soil of Sweden. Each coin told a story, a journey across half the world. And the Vikings didn't just trade goods, they traded ideas. They brought back new words, new art styles, new ways of building and governing. Every market day was a classroom. Despite their rough reputation, the Viking merchants had rules. Deals were sealed with handshakes, oaths or small gifts. And breaking your word could ruin you faster than any sword fight. They understood reputation was currency. If you cheated someone in Hedeby, you wouldn't be welcome in Birka. And besides, the sea had a way of keeping everyone humble. No matter how clever your deal was, one bad storm could take everything. So traders learned to respect balance, risk and reward, tide and wind. It was business, but it was also philosophy. Of course, trade life wasn't all wisdom and glory. Dockside humour was its own language. Sailors joked that the best deal was selling the same fish twice. Some traders bragged so much that locals called them storm talkers. All noise, no cargo. And the smell? Let's just say a market filled with drying cod, tanned leather, and a few unwashed sailors wasn't exactly perfume. But somehow it worked. Because the ports were alive, noisy, colourful, endlessly human. Even a pickpocket knew the rule. You don't steal during trade hours. You wait until night. The Viking trade routes stretched far beyond Europe. Through rivers and forests, they reached the Volga and Dnieper in the east, down toward the Black Sea and the glittering city of Byzantium. There, Norse merchants became known as the Rus, the ancestors of Russia's name. They traded furs for silk, honey for spices, slaves for silver. They wore Byzantine jewellery, carried Arabic coins, and came home telling stories of domes that shone like the sun. The line between trader and adventurer blurred completely. For the Vikings, it wasn't enough to survive. They wanted to see how far the world could go. Trade changed everything. It softened the Viking world, bit by bit. Wealth replaced warfare. At least sometimes. Kings began minting coins, laws were written, towns were fortified. And for all the fear they once inspired, the Vikings slowly became part of the very world they'd shocked. They learned Latin from priests, Greek from traders, and faith from the same monks they'd once terrified. Silver may have been their treasure, but connection was their legacy. The same ships that once brought fear now brought friendship, or at least business. So as the fires fade from Lindisfarne's memory, new lights rise along the coasts, market torches flickering in the dark, guiding ships home. The Vikings had found something even more powerful than conquest: community. Not ruled by kings, but by exchange, by trust and trade winds. But the sea is wide and the rivers run deep. In our next chapter, we follow those silver trails east, through forests and across empires, to see how the north met the east, and how the Rus carved their legend on the rivers of the world. The western seas have grown familiar. Now the long ships turn their prows toward the rising sun. Ahead lies a world of misty rivers, endless birch trees and gold-tinted horizons. Tonight we follow the Vikings east, down the great waterways that would one day carve the bones of nations. The Baltic gave way to rivers that ran like veins through the continent. Here the long ships didn't battle waves, but currents. Each bend in the water opened into silence. Green forests, mirror-flat lakes, the cry of cranes overhead. Sailors called it the Road of the Varangians. It wound from the Gulf of Finland through the rivers Neva, Volkhov, and Dnieper, a slow, twisting highway that connected the icy north to the warm Black Sea. The people who followed it became known as the Russ. Their story would one day give a name to Russia itself. Travelling inland was no easy thing. The ships had to be carried across land between rivers, a brutal task called a portage. Imagine 50 men dragging a ship over wet moss and roots, muttering prayers to Thor, and probably a few creative curses. Mosquitoes hummed like small demons. Wolves watched from the trees. One wrong step, and a boat worth a year's work could crack its keel. And yet somehow, they laughed through it. The Norse had a habit of turning every hardship into a story. Someone would always say, "At least the river's downhill from here." It rarely was. Along the banks lived Slavic tribes, farmers, hunters, traders. They watched these strange fair-haired visitors glide up the rivers with eyes wide as moons. At first they traded. Honey for iron, furs for salt, stories for safety. Then slowly, the two worlds began to mix. Some Vikings stayed, marrying local women, learning new tongues, blending customs. They built wooden towns at crossroads. Ladoga, Novgorod, Kiev. Each would one day grow into a city that shaped Europe. The Russ weren't conquerors here. They were connectors, stitching together the north and the east with ropes of trade and bloodline. From these rivers flowed riches beyond imagining. Caravans came from the far south, carrying silks, spices, wine and weapons. From the north came furs, amber and slaves, harsh but true. At the heart of it all was silver from the Caliphate, stamped with Arabic script so beautiful that Vikings sometimes wore the coins as jewellery instead of spending them. They called the trading towns Gardar, enclosures, each one a melting pot where Norsemen, Arabs, Persians and Greeks bargained over cups of honey wine, while translators tried to keep up. No one spoke the same language, but everyone understood the sound of coins. All rivers led to one place, Miklagard, the great city. We know it as Constantinople. When Viking ships finally reached its harbour, they were stunned. Domes glittered like suns. Walls stretched higher than any hill they'd ever seen. The market smelled of perfume and roasted meat, not fish and smoke. Many Norse joined the Varangian Guard, an elite unit serving the Byzantine emperor himself. Imagine a tall, red-haired sailor from Sweden standing under marble arches, in armour polished like mirrors. The emperor trusted them because, as one historian put it, they feared no man, only boredom. For pay, they earned gold. For loyalty, they earned fame. And for homesickness, they drank. Some things never change. The eastern routes made the Viking world bigger, and gentler in some ways. They brought back not just goods, but new faiths and philosophies. They saw icons, churches, and calligraphy that shimmered like art itself. From the Greeks, they learned architecture. From the Arabs, they learned trade mathematics. From the Slavs, they learned to farm broader fields. Little by little, the Norse world was changing, its hard northern edges softened by contact with civilization. They still sang of Odin and Thor, but now they also crossed themselves before storms. They built stone churches beside wooden longhouses, and in the space between gods and gold, a new identity was forming. At night, when the fires went out, and only the frogs and owls remained, a sailor might stare into the dark water and see his own reflection ripple. How far he'd come from home, and how much farther the rivers went. The same water that carried them out would carry back stories of cities of light, of emperors who ruled 1,000 miles of land, and of markets where silver shone brighter than stars. In a single lifetime, they had stretched the world. They had proven that the sea and the river were not barriers, just invitations. So as dawn breaks over the Dnieper and the longships drift toward the sunrise, the Norsemen rest their oars. The rivers have made them merchants, ambassadors, and something new, a bridge between worlds. But the urge to sail farther never leaves them. Beyond the eastern forests, another dream is stirring. The dream of going west again, past the edge of the known map, where land and sky trade places. The rivers of the east fade behind us. Ahead lies the wide Atlantic, grey, endless and full of whispers. For the Vikings, the world was growing smaller. Every coast they touched gave them courage to chase the next horizon. And in time, they began to look west, into the fog, toward a dream that shimmered like starlight on the water. No one knows who said it first. Maybe a fisherman staring out to sea pointed toward the setting sun and said, "There's land out there, I can feel it." It sounded like madness, but madness was a kind of fuel to the people of the North. They had already turned survival into adventure, turned hardship into story. Why not chase the edge of the world? The West held a promise, not of gold, but of space. Room to breathe. Room to build farms where the soil wasn't all stone and frost. Room to start again. And so they built their ships stronger, stocked them with food, and waited for a summer when the sea seemed just calm enough to try. The first stops were stepping stones, small green islands rising from the fog, the Shetlands and Faroes, wind-whipped, treeless, and stubbornly beautiful. The land was rough, but there was grass for sheep and cliffs full of birds. The air smelled of salt and wild thyme. It wasn't paradise, but it was peace. They built small wooden houses with turf roofs, planted barley, and watched the sea with cautious eyes. Here the storms taught them patience, and the long, quiet nights taught them to dream further west. Every time a ship vanished beyond the horizon, no one knew if it would ever return. But sometimes it did, with stories of strange volcanic islands, black sand, and steaming hills, a place that sounded like it belonged to another world. That place was Iceland, discovered by accident, settled by courage. The first Norse sailors to see it must have thought the gods were playing tricks. Pillars of smoke rose from the mountains, rivers steamed, and the earth itself groaned like something alive. But when they landed, they found clean water, green valleys, and rich fishing grounds. The soil was hard but possible, the air sharp and clean. Soon word spread back home, of free land, wide as imagination. Families packed their ships, bringing goats, tools, even bits of soil from their old farms, as if to carry a piece of home across the sea. Within a century, Iceland became a small miracle, a nation of storytellers at the edge of nowhere. It would give birth to the sagas, the poems, and the spirit that kept the Viking heart beating long after the raids had faded. Of course, sailing that far wasn't all glory and poetry. It was also a lot of seasickness. The Atlantic wasn't polite. It tossed ships like toys, froze fingers to the oar, and soaked every bit of food in salt. Sailors joked that the gods didn't want them to find new land. "They're just trying to make sure we deserve it," someone said between waves. Still, they laughed, because humour was armour against fear, and every time they saw a puffin, someone would claim it was watching them specifically. You can imagine the arguments that followed. But one night, through rain and fog, they saw something else. A dark shape on the horizon that didn't move. Land. The settlers built their homes close to the sea, as if they couldn't quite let go of the water. They planted crops, grazed animals, and learned to read the moods of their new land. They also brought their stories, the myths of Odin, Thor, and the Nine Worlds, and mixed them with the new landscape. Volcanoes became gateways to the underworld. Geysers were the breath of giants, and the northern lights, rippling above snow and steam, were the same Valkyrie armour that had once shone over Norway. In this far corner of the earth, myth and reality lived side by side, and somehow it all made sense. The Western dream didn't stop at Iceland. A few brave souls pushed farther still, to Greenland, and even to a land beyond that, covered in forests and mystery. We'll get there soon enough. But what mattered most wasn't distance. It was mindset. The Vikings didn't sail west just to escape. They sailed because not knowing was worse than any storm. They believed the world was wide, and that courage was the only map you really needed. And maybe that's the lesson they left us. Every great story starts with the question, what if? As night falls over Iceland, the wind hums across empty plains. In the glow of a turf house fire, a child listens to stories of faraway lands. Tales of green shores, strange people, and a sea that never ends. The parents smile, tired from work, but they don't stop the storyteller, because one day, that child will grow up, build a ship, and follow the same dream west toward the next horizon. The dream has carried them far, past Iceland, past Greenland, into the grey unknown. No maps, no guides, only a memory of rumours whispered by sailors who swore they'd seen land through the fog. And then one morning, as the sun rose through a thin mist, it appeared, green, wide, and waiting. This was Vinland. The story begins with Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, the same man who founded the settlements in Greenland. Leif had grown up hearing tales of explorers who drifted west by accident, stories dismissed as sailors' gossip. But curiosity runs in Viking blood. So, one summer he set sail with a small crew, not to raid but to see. They followed the gulls, the driftwood, the subtle pull of the wind. And after weeks at sea, when supplies ran low and the fog refused to lift, the horizon finally broke open into green hills. They had reached a world no Norseman had ever seen. Or perhaps a world that had been waiting all along. The crew called the new land Vinland, the land of wine, because of the wild grapes they found along the rivers. It might have been poetic exaggeration, or maybe they just really missed mead. But what mattered was this: it was warm, fertile, alive. The grass grew high, the forests thick, and the air smelled like earth and flowers, not salt and snow. After a lifetime of grey skies and frozen ground, it must have felt like stepping into a dream. A place where the gods themselves had softened their breath. They built small houses along the coast, wooden frames covered in turf, much like the ones back in Iceland. They stored their ships nearby, ready in case the sea decided it wanted them back. Days were spent exploring. Nights were filled with stories by the fire, some true, some not, and some halfway between. There were rivers full of fish, forests full of game, and a peace that almost felt suspicious. No frostbite, no starving winters, just sunlight and possibility. Leif, ever cautious, took it all in quietly. He knew paradise never comes without a catch. One morning, while collecting timber, the Norsemen saw movement in the trees. People. The local inhabitants, later called the Skraelings in Norse sagas, watched from a distance. The two groups stared at each other, unsure whether to smile or run. No one spoke the same language, so they did what humans always do when words fail. They traded gestures. A gift of red cloth, a small trinket in return, a moment of shared curiosity. For a brief while, the meetings were peaceful. But mistrust grows easily between strangers. A noise mistaken for threat. A glance read the wrong way. And the dream began to crack. The sagas say there were skirmishes, confusion, fear. In the end, Leif decided the land was beautiful, but dangerous to keep. He sailed home, leaving behind more questions than answers. We still don't know exactly where Vinland was. Some say Newfoundland in Canada. Others believe it stretched farther south, maybe even to Nova Scotia or Maine. What we do know is this: the Norse were the first Europeans to reach the Americas, 5 centuries before Columbus. And then somehow, they let it go. No colonies, no empires. Just a whisper in a saga, and a few rings of turf discovered by archaeologists at Lance aux Meadows. It's almost poetic. The greatest discovery of the Viking Age, and they treated it like a passing dream. Leif didn't see himself as a conqueror. He wasn't chasing power or fame. He was following something quieter, the same feeling that had pushed every sailor before him. Curiosity, that need to know what lies beyond the mist, that belief that somewhere out there, there's more to the story. And that's what made the Vikings remarkable. Not just their strength, but their willingness to listen to the horizon. Maybe that's why their stories still travel. Because deep down, we all have a little of that restlessness, that same need to see what's next. Of course, not everyone on the voyage was a philosopher. Some were just tired, sunburned, and annoyed. The sagas tell of one sailor who, after seeing Vinland, said simply, "It's nice, but I still prefer home." Another apparently complained about the mosquitoes, proof that even history's great explorers couldn't escape nature's little jokes. And yet, when they finally sailed back, every one of them carried the same faraway look in their eyes. Because once you've seen a new world, it's hard to fit back into the old one. So the longships turned homeward again, their sails glowing red in the sunset. Behind them lay a land of forests and mystery, untouched, unsung and unforgettable. They called it Vinland. The rest of the world called it impossible. But the Vikings had proven something profound. Even at the edge of the map, there's always another horizon. After the storms, the sails, and the sound of oars, comes silence, the kind you only find by the hearth, where the sea's roar fades into the memory of waves. Tonight we leave the ships behind and step inside the Viking home, a place of warmth, work, laughter, and life. When a longship came home, you could hear it before you saw it. Oars clapping the water, horns echoing down the fjord. Families would rush to the shore, squinting through the mist, counting sails. And when they finally spotted their loved ones, tired, salt-soaked, maybe missing a boot. There was no speech, no drama. Just a quiet smile, a hand on a shoulder, a nod that meant you made it. For all their adventures, the Vikings were never far from home in their hearts. Because the sea was the thrill, but home was the reason. The Longhouse was the centre of Viking life. Part home, part hall, part legend. Picture a single long room made of timber, the roof low and steep, smoke curling up through a hole in the centre. Inside it was dim and golden, firelight flickering across carved beams, furs spread on benches, tools hanging from the walls. Chickens sometimes wandered inside, pretending to be furniture. Down the middle ran the fire pit. Warmth, cooking, and storytelling all in one. Around it sat the family, parents, children, grandparents, farmhands, guests, even a few dogs and the occasional goat. Privacy wasn't really a Viking thing, but community was. Life followed the seasons. In spring they ploughed and planted. In summer they fished and travelled. In autumn they harvested and prepared for winter. A time of long nights, long stories, and even longer naps. Every tool mattered. Every task had rhythm. Grinding grain, milking cows, repairing nets, simple things done with quiet pride. And while the men often get all the glory, it was the women who ran the show at home. They managed farms, property, trade and family while the men were away. The Norse had a word for such women. Husfru, literally, the lady of the house. If you ever wanted to know who was really in charge, it wasn't hard to tell. Meals were humble but hearty. Bread baked on flat stones, dried fish, barley porridge, cheese and stew thick with whatever was left from last week. A good meal wasn't about luxury. It was about warmth. And if someone unexpected arrived at the door, you fed them first, asked questions later. Hospitality wasn't just polite. It was sacred. But when the harvest was good or a ship came home full of silver, they knew how to celebrate. Feasts would last for days. Horns of mead passed around, songs rising over the crackle of fire. Someone always told a story that began with, "You'll never believe what happened on the way back from Ireland." And usually no one did. The Viking home wasn't quiet at night. It hummed with voices. This was when the skalds, the poets and storytellers, came alive. They recited sagas of heroes, gods and ghosts, weaving history and myth together until no one could tell which was which. Children listened wide-eyed. Old warriors nodded in rhythm, eyes distant, seeing old battles replayed in the smoke. Every story was a bridge, from the past to the future, from the sea to the hearth. Because when the nights are long and the winter's endless, stories are as important as food. Not every tale was epic. Some were funny, small, wonderfully human. Like the story of the farmer who claimed Thor borrowed his goat and never returned it. Or the fisherman who swore he saw a sea spirit, which turned out to be his own reflection after too much ale. The Vikings were practical people. If they couldn't change the weather, they made jokes about it. If the gods were moody, they rolled their eyes and said, "Aren't we all?" That humour, simple, dry, honest, kept them steady through every storm, whether on land or at sea. More than anything, the Viking home was a symbol of balance. They could conquer kingdoms, yet they built with their hands. They could sail to the edge of the world, yet always came back to the same fire. Inside those longhouses, the sound of hammers, laughter, and lullabies echoed together. Proof that history isn't only written in battles and voyages. Sometimes it's written in quiet moments. A mother weaving by the fire, a child carving a toy boat, a man mending his boots while humming an old tune. Outside, the snow falls softly over the fjords. Inside, the flames dance, and the smell of smoke and bread fills the air. For all their fame as warriors, the warmth of a home, was what truly kept the Viking spirit alive. But not everyone stayed by the fire. Some sought adventure in a different form. Power, politics, and the making of kings. Next time. Chapter 11. Women of the North. History remembers kings and conquerors, but in the North, power didn't always wear a crown. It wore a woven shawl, carried a set of keys, and ruled from beside the hearth. Tonight we turn from the long ships to the long houses, to the women who held the Viking world together. In every Viking home, one sound told you who was in charge. The quiet jingle of keys. They hung from the belt of the husfru, the lady of the house. Those keys unlocked storerooms, chests, food supplies, and even the family's silver. They were more than tools, they were symbols of trust, of power, of responsibility. While the men sailed for glory, it was the women who kept the fire burning, the farm running, and the family fed. If a husband didn't return from the sea, and many didn't, she didn't collapse. She simply kept going. Because in the north, strength wasn't about shouting, it was about enduring. A typical day began before dawn. She lit the fire, tended the animals, milked goats, spun wool, and baked bread thick enough to stop an arrow. Between tasks, she managed trade, hired workers, settled disputes, and organised feasts. If you think that sounds exhausting, you're right. But for Viking women, it was simply life. They owned property, inherited wealth, and could even divorce their husbands, which, in medieval Europe, was practically revolutionary. And if the husband mistreated her, she could walk away with the dowry and the house. Fair to say that kept some men polite. Of course, not every woman stayed by the hearth. Some picked up shields and spears. The sagas tell of Lagertha, who fought beside Ragnar Lothbrok, cutting through armies with her hair loose and her heart unbroken. They speak of Freydis, Leif Eriksson's sister, who sailed to Vinland and fought off attackers barefoot, wielding a sword and shouting loud enough to frighten an army. Were all these stories true? Maybe not, but the fact they were told at all means something. Even legend has roots in respect. To the Norse, courage wasn't just for men, it was a quality of the soul. Anyone could have it, and some of the bravest happened to wear braids instead of helmets. Beyond warriors and homemakers were the Völvers, the seeresses. Women believed to speak with the gods and glimpse what others could not. They wandered from village to village, wrapped in cloaks of blue and beads, carrying staffs carved with symbols of fate. When one entered a hall, even the proudest warriors stood. She would sit by the fire, close her eyes, and murmur words that blurred the line between song and spell. Her visions guided kings, farmers, and explorers alike. In a world balanced between light and dark, the Völva stood in the middle, neither feared nor worshipped, but honoured for her connection to what lay beyond understanding. Despite their legends, Viking women were just as human as anyone. They worried about the harvest, scolded children, complained about the weather, and gossiped about whose mead was too weak. Some even wrote runic graffiti on wooden walls, short blunt messages like "Gaida was here," or the classic "This ale is terrible." The sagas record one woman who told her husband, "You can't fight fate, but you can at least be on time for dinner." 1,000 years later, that energy still feels familiar. Women were the keepers of stories. Songs sung while spinning wool, lullabies whispered beside the fire, tales of gods and monsters passed down through generations. They remembered what men forgot, the small human details. Who laughed in battle? Who planted the first row of barley after a hard winter? Who loved, lost, and kept living anyway? Their words became the roots of the Icelandic sagas, the world's first written histories told from memory. Without those stories, much of what we know about the Viking world would have vanished like mist over the sea. The Norse world believed in balance, male and female, strength and softness, sea and soil. One built, the other preserved. One fought the waves, the other calmed them. When archaeologists opened Viking graves, they found as many women buried with fine jewellery, imported glass and weapons as men with swords. It wasn't equality in our modern sense, but it was respect. A recognition that the North would have frozen long ago, if not for the women who thawed it with patience. So as we drift through the firelight of those old longhouses, we can still hear them. The laughter, the lullabies, the quiet commands that kept the world turning. They didn't need to conquer. They didn't need to shout. Their power lived in every meal cooked, every story told, every key turned in a wooden lock. And when the men returned from sea, they came home not to queens or servants, but to equals. The sea is quiet now. The sails are furled, the swords sheathed, and somewhere in a longhouse, beneath smoke and starlight, a voice begins to rise. Not a king, not a warrior, but a storyteller. A skald, the keeper of memory, the guardian of words. Tonight we sit beside that fire to listen to how the Vikings turned life into legend. In the Viking world, words were sacred. They believed language had magic, not just to describe the world, but to shape it. After all, Odin himself was said to have discovered the runes only through suffering, hanging from the world tree until their power revealed itself. To speak well was to cast a spell. A poet could calm a crowd, insult a king, or make a warrior's name live forever. And so, every great hall had a skald, part historian, part musician. part magician. Their tools weren't swords or axes, but rhythm, rhyme, and memory. And their audience, tired farmers, proud warriors, sleepy children, listened like the fate of the world depended on it. Picture it: a longhouse at night. The air smells of pine smoke and stew. Men lean close to the fire, women spin wool, children peek over their blankets. Then, the skald clears his throat. He doesn't shout. He begins softly. A rhythm like oars in calm water. A few words at first, then more. A rising tide of sound and story. He might tell of Odin's wisdom, Thor's thunder, or Freya's beauty. Or he might tell a saga. Tales of real people, half myth, half memory. Kings and traders, explorers and dreamers. Every word carefully chosen, every pause perfectly timed. And for a moment, everyone in the hall forgets the cold outside. The word saga simply means story or saying. But for the Vikings, it meant something far deeper, a way of remembering who they were. Before paper, before ink, before history books, the sagas were history. They kept track of family lines, feuds, voyages, and dreams. They were passed from voice to voice, fire to fire, over generations. And when they were finally written down in Iceland centuries later, they became masterpieces, not of fantasy, but of memory. Take the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, a warrior poet with a temper as wild as his verses. He could swing an axe and recite a poem before the blood even dried. Not exactly bedtime material, but memorable. Or the Laxdæla saga, full of love, jealousy, and quiet heartbreak. Proof that even in the Viking world, emotions could cut deeper than swords. The sagas weren't all gloom and glory. They had humour, dry, sharp, and wonderfully human. A hero might be described as so brave he once wrestled his own reflection. A rival might be insulted for having the courage of a damp goat. Some poets even roasted their enemies through verse, a deadly art called need, the insult poem. If a skald wrote a nasty verse about you, your reputation was done. Worse than losing a duel, because you couldn't heal from mockery. One Viking law even made slanderous poetry illegal, proof that words, in the north, could wound as deep as blades. Imagine explaining that to a court today. Your Honour, he rhymed at me aggressively. The rhythm of these poems wasn't random. It followed ancient patterns, alliteration instead of rhyme, beats instead of melody. Think of it like the sound of oars, 2 strokes, 1 pause, strong, steady, simple. It made the verses easier to remember, vital in a time when forgetting meant losing history. And when you've spent a lifetime at sea, timing is everything. Even in storytelling, they rode by rhythm. Some skalds served kings, writing praise poems so grand that rulers paid in gold and jewellery. Others wandered, trading stories for supper. A few became legends themselves, their verses surviving for centuries after their bones were gone. When an Icelander recited a saga, they weren't just performing, they were keeping someone alive. And that's the strange magic of the skald, immortality through memory. Not by conquest or crown, but by words whispered into the dark. Why did these stories matter so much? Because the north was harsh, winters were long, nights longer. A tale could outlast hunger, outshine despair, keep a people believing they were more than the cold trying to kill them. Every saga was a torch, every verse, a spark. Together they lit the long night of history, so that even now, 1,000 years later, we still feel their warmth. That's not just storytelling, that's survival. The fire burns low, the skald's voice fades into the hum of wind outside, and for a moment the only sound left is the whisper of embers, the soft memory of words. The Vikings believed stories could live forever. Tonight, we've proved them right, but soon those stories will belong not to poets but to rulers, men who turned verses into laws and songs into crowns. Next time, Chapter 13, The Age of Kings. Every saga needs a crown, and every age of heroes ends the same way, with order rising from chaos. The world that began with oars and axes now turns toward thrones and treaties. Tonight we sail into the twilight of the Viking Age, the time when the North learned to rule itself. By the late 9th century, the Vikings had seen it all. They had raided and traded from Greenland to Baghdad. They'd built settlements, founded cities, and carved their names into the edges of maps. But a new challenge was waiting. Not across the sea, but at home. Too many chieftains, too much pride, too little peace. Every fjord had its own ruler, every village its own laws. Someone had to bring it all together, not with a sword, but with vision. And so began the slow rise of kings. Legend says it started with love, as so many stories do. A young chieftain named Harold Fairhair fell in love with a woman named Gyda. She told him quite calmly that she wouldn't marry him until he ruled all of Norway. Most men would have written a sad poem and moved on. Harold just nodded and said, "All right then." It took him 10 years in one of battles, alliances, and stubborn persistence. But he did it. He united Norway under one crown. Then he finally married her. Say what you will. That's commitment. Harold's reign brought order, taxes, and, depending on who you ask, the first official Viking bureaucracy. Many smaller lords hated it, of course, but love and ambition had done what 1,000 raids could not. It made Norway one. Across the North Sea, Viking leaders were doing something similar. In England, Nut the Great, a Danish prince, built a vast empire in the early 11th century, ruling over Denmark, Norway, and England at once. Under his command, the Viking world became not a swarm of raiders, but a single, organised power. Knut wasn't just a conqueror, he was clever. He kept local customs, honoured both Norse and Christian faiths, and managed to keep peace in 3 countries that had spent decades fighting each other. There's even a story that he once ordered the sea to stop rising, to prove to his flatterers that even kings couldn't command nature. A rare moment of humility wrapped in royal theatre. You have to admire the drama. As kingdoms grew, the old Viking way began to fade. Christianity spread, bringing new laws, new gods, and new forms of writing. The sagas that once lived in memory were inked on parchment. The myths became history. The longships were replaced by merchant fleets. The raiding crews became tax collectors. And the same men who once roamed the oceans began sitting in council halls, discussing treaties instead of tides. The Viking Age didn't end with a battle. It ended with a meeting. Of course, kingship didn't fix everything. Some rulers were wise. Others were just tired warlords in fancy hats. Court politics replaced sea storms. Instead of arguing with waves, people now argued about land rights. Different kind of drowning, same frustration. And yet you can almost hear the laughter echoing through the halls. The North had changed, but the people hadn't lost their humour. They still joked that a wise king listens to his wife, and an even wiser one listens before she asks. What these kings truly built wasn't just land, it was identity. They gave the scattered Norse tribes a sense of belonging beyond their fjord or farm. They built towns with names still on the map today. Trondheim, Roskilde, Aarhus. They minted coins, built churches, and sent envoys across Europe. The wild north had become a neighbour to the world, but even as the crowns gleamed, the old spirit never died. In every hall, in every harbour, someone still whispered the old stories, of gods, of voyages, of courage. The kings ruled the land, but the sea still ruled the heart. Historians like to give exact dates. 1066, the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the death of King Harold Hardrada, as the end of the Viking Age, but that's too neat for real life. You can't stop an age with a single sword swing. Hardrada's defeat marked the last great Viking invasion of England, but his death didn't erase what came before. It simply turned warriors into ancestors. The raiders became farmers, the explorers became kings, and the kings became legends. The torches in the long hall flicker low. The sound of waves outside has faded into memory, and in that stillness a new world begins, quieter, but no less proud. The Viking Age is ending, yet the echo of the oars, the songs of the Skalds, and the courage of the North still drift through time. Next time. Chapter 14, The Last Voyages. The sea is calm again. The oars are fewer now, but still, they move. This is the final voyage. Not of one ship, but of an entire age. A time when the sails that once darkened horizons slowly lowered for the last time. Tonight, we follow the Vikings on their final journeys, not toward conquest, but toward memory. By the 11th century, the world was changing faster than the wind. The longships still sailed, but they no longer brought fear. They brought trade, pilgrims, and peace. The sons of raiders were now merchants, farmers, kings, and monks. Yes, monks. The same faith that once rang bells in fear now echoed through Norse churches built from the same timber as the old ships. The oar strokes slowed, but they never stopped. Far to the west, The settlements in Greenland struggled against the cold. At first, they thrived, farming, fishing, trading ivory and furs with Europe. But the climate shifted, the winters grew longer, the trade ships stopped coming. Still, they endured. For generations, families kept the old faith quietly in their hearts, even as they built Christian chapels on frozen soil. Imagine those nights, auroras rippling over snow, silence stretching from the mountains to the sea. They must have wondered if the world had forgotten them, and in time it did. When ships returned centuries later, the farms were empty, the houses silent. The last embers of the Western Viking world had gone out. Back in Europe, the raids that once terrified kingdoms had all but vanished. The coasts of England were guarded now by stone towers and organised armies. The kings of Scandinavia were too busy managing taxes to chase glory across the sea. The Viking longships that once carried fear across oceans now carried cargo: fish, cloth, salt and dreams. The old songs of battle faded into ballads. Children still played with wooden swords, but their parents whispered, "That was long ago." It wasn't defeat, it was evolution. It was abanfresidmai. Christianity spread across the north like dawn breaking after a long night. The old gods didn't disappear in anger. They just slipped quietly into the background. Odin's ravens became church carvings. Thor's hammer became a cross on a necklace. The stories remained, only the names changed. In stone churches built beside fjords, priests spoke Latin prayers, and fishermen still prayed in whispers to the wind, just in case the old gods were still listening. Because if there's one thing a Viking never did, it was taking chances with the weather. For all their reputation, the last generations of Vikings weren't so different from us. They argued about taxes, they worried about their children, they complained that the winters weren't what they used to be. In Iceland, poets still wrote sagas, but now they added their own parents and neighbours into the stories. Imagine realising you'd just become a side character in your cousin's epic. They had become self-aware, the first to know they were living in the afterglow of something great. Not the dawn, but the dusk, and they made peace with that. And even after the last king was crowned and the last ship docked for good, the sea didn't forget. On calm nights, sailors still claimed they could hear the echo of oars in the mist. Steady, unhurried, timeless. They said it was the spirits of the old mariners, rowing forever between worlds. And maybe they were right, because history doesn't vanish. It drifts, it fades, then resurfaces, reshaped by waves and memory. Every modern ship crossing the North Atlantic follows routes first traced by Viking hands. Every compass, every chart, every explorer owes them something. Their journey never really ended, it just changed form. What the Vikings left behind wasn't just artifacts, it was attitude. They proved that courage doesn't come from certainty, but from motion. They faced a vast, cold, unpredictable world and said, "Let's see what's out there." They didn't always succeed, but they always tried. And even when the sails came down and the swords rusted, that spirit lived on. In sailors, explorers, dreamers, and anyone who's ever looked at a map and wondered what lies beyond its edge. The tide recedes, the fire burns low, the longships sleep beneath the sand and the snow. The Viking age is ending, but its echo remains. In the creak of a wooden hull, in the whisper of wind across water, in the courage to keep moving forward, even when the world grows dark. Next time, our final chapter. Echoes in the night. The sea has gone still. The longships are gone. The fires have burned low. Only echoes remain. Whispers of wood, water and memory. Tonight, as we end our journey through the Viking world, we listen not for battle cries or thunder, but for the quiet heartbeat that still lingers beneath the northern sky. Where once stood harbours crowded with ships, there are only ripples now. Grass covers the shipyards, and the sea, once alive with sails, mirrors the clouds. Somewhere beneath layers of silt and time, the skeletons of longships rest like sleeping dragons. Their iron nails rusted, their timbers softened by centuries of tide. But when the wind blows just right, you can almost hear them creak again, as if the wood itself remembers what it felt like to move. History never truly sinks, it drifts just beneath the surface. The Ega. Imagine a Viking longhouse on a winter night. The world outside is frozen white, but inside, the fire still burns. Children gather near the flames, listening to stories of their ancestors. Gods, voyages, heroes who crossed the sea and never returned. The storyteller's voice is steady, soft, Each word glows like an ember. Each pause feels like a heartbeat. And those centuries will pass, those stories will travel, whispered from one generation to the next, until they find their way to us, here tonight. That's how history works. It doesn't shout, it whispers. The Vikings are long gone, yet their thread runs through the fabric of our modern world. In the words we speak: sky, window, knife, husband, all born from Old Norse. In the names of our days: Tuesday for Tyr, Wednesday for Odin, Thursday for Thor. Even now their gods live quietly in our calendars. Their stories, once carved into wood and stone, now flow through books, films and bedtime tales like this one. We don't just remember them, we carry them, in language and curiosity, in the human need to wander, human need. The North taught them everything: how to listen to wind, how to read stars, how to trust their hands when the world turned against them. And maybe that's the true gift of the Vikings. Not the conquests or the kings, but the courage to move. To look at a grey horizon and say, let's go anyway. We all have our seas to cross, not of water, but of doubt, of change, of fear. And somewhere, deep down, that same Viking spark pushes us forward. The same whisper says, row. They were explorers, poets, and yes, world-class complainers. One saga tells of a sailor who, after months at sea, muttered, if Odin wanted us to live on water, he would have given us gills. Another says a chieftain once declared, the gods must be tired of hearing my name and I'll give them a week off. I'll give papa. Even in their last voyages, they found humour. Because laughter, like courage, is a form of survival. And maybe that's why we still love them. They were flawed, fearless, and undeniably human. Step outside with them one last time. Above the fjords, the sky glows with northern lights, ribbons of green and silver weaving through the dark. The same lights the Vikings saw 1,000 years ago, the same ones that guided their ships through fog and night. To them it was magic, the armour of Valkyries, the breath of the gods. To us it's science, but no less beautiful. And as we watch the sky shift and shimmer, it's easy to imagine a voice carried by the wind whispering, we were here, we sailed, we dreamed, remember us. The Viking Age may have ended, but its echo lingers, in museums and manuscripts, in the rhythm of waves, in the stories told long after the fire dies down. Every time someone sets sail, takes a risk or looks at a map and wonders, what's out there? That's the echo. Every time a storyteller speaks into the quiet and says, once upon a time in the north, that's the echo. The ships are gone. The oars are still. But the sound remains, because history doesn't end. It drifts into night, waiting for someone to listen. So now as the stars fade and the sea grows calm, we close our journey. From the icy beginnings to the age of kings, from the roar of battle to the whisper of home. The story of the Vikings is not about war but wonder. They showed us that courage can be quiet, that strength can be gentle, that even the fiercest hearts need a place to rest. And maybe that's what history really is. Not the noise of power, but the echo of humanity that refuses to fade. This has been Vikings, the entire story. Raiders, traders, explorers. I'm glad you drifted with me through the firelight of their world. Now let the waves take the rest. Close your eyes. The story will still be here when you wake.